my name is Courtney and welcome to my channel. I'm a fourth year anthropology student with a focus on archaeology. I'm doing a short series of YouTube videos on Victorian mourning for my Archaeologies of Gender class. For those who are unfamiliar with archaeology, it is the study of human past and cultures through the analysis of the materials they have left behind. For a second, I want you to think about what kind of things you have in your room. Do you have books or knickknacks or family heirlooms? Anything. Where are they in regards to your bed or your closet or to the door? Do they have any sort of significance to you? Is it monetary, sentimental, or something else? In archaeology, the placement of these things left behind is as important as what those things are. It's the context that matters, which is the relationship of what things are to each other. This is key in creating our understanding of the significance of what they mean to you or to the society we found them in. In this first video, I will give you some background on the topic, such as when was the Victorian period, what kinds of class and gender divisions existed in the US, Canada, and the UK during this period, and what kinds of artifacts archaeologists used to learn about them. In my second video, I will discuss mourning jewelry and the fashion of mourning. While mourning does not take up the entirety of Victorian life for the average person, it was still very important that people follow the proper procedures and etiquette. One type of mourning jewelry is called hair jewelry. It's essentially hair that is twisted, shaped, and then set into place in elaborate patterns and pieces of jewelry to create a memento mori of the deceased. In my final video, I will discuss headstones, or grave markers. For an archaeologist, a grave marker is an interesting artifact because it tells us about the deceased, like their demographic information, such as their birth and death dates, maybe even where they were born, their age and name, and sometimes their familial relations. The epitaphs, which are the sayings on the grave marker about the person, for example, loving wife or beloved son, can tell you about what they or their family wanted them to be remembered for. Grave markers also tell us about the kinds of trends that were popular at the time, and because we know when these trends occurred, we can date these older monuments. And I'll give you a little spoiler, Victorians are all about symbolism when it came to grave markers. Before we get any further, I want to stress that, yeah, some of the things the Victorians did were pretty weird, but the majority of the mourning practices, or at least the Abrahamic Western style of practices, come from the Victorians. The dressing in all black, the viewing of the deceased, funeral processions to the cemetery, and even some of the grave marker symbols have all remained the same. Some of these practices have even been tweaked a little bit for modern audiences. Check out video 2 for more on this. So to give some background for my project and my next videos, I want to answer these questions as best I can. When was the Victorian period, which is going to be my very quick history lesson? What kinds of class divisions existed? What kinds of gender divisions existed? What types of artifacts have been discovered or are relevant to the gender and class divisions? What areas of the world will I be focusing on? And a brief mention of what topics will follow. So first off, when was the Victorian period? Well, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Victorian era refers to, quote, the period between approximately 1820 and 1914 corresponding roughly but not exactly to the period of Queen Victoria's reign, end quote. And I know some people will take issue with this because technically her son took over in 1901 after her death. So some of the major events that occurred that corresponds with the areas I've been using research from includes the Industrial Revolution in 1760 to 1840. It kind of sort of counts, but it definitely leads to a lot of the other events that follow and was a really big driving force in the economic booms and busts for the next century or so. The Great Irish Famine occurs in 1845 to 1852. Canada becomes a country in 1857. The American Civil War occurs from 1861 to 1865. And for those crime lovers, which kind of helped me date it a little bit, Jack the Ripper was in 1888, towards the end of the Victorian period. And in 1914 is the start of World War I. So what areas of the world have I included research from? Well, that's Canada, the United States, England, obviously, and Ireland. Gender and class divisions during the Victorian period was important, and so-called separate spheres of influence existed for men and women. Men were supposed to exist within the public spaces, while women's spaces were typically in the private. However, class, especially those in the middle and lower classes, generally meant that they didn't have the luxury of separate spaces. For example, in a household guide published from the time period, it states that, quote, "As a rule, the females of the family do not pay any visits until after the funeral," end quote. But, quote, "It sometimes happens among the poorer classes that the female relatives attend the funeral," end quote. Of course, the main reason is women's so-called hysteria, but the point is that because of their already low social status, the poor could get away with breaking some of the traditions. So speaking of class and gender divisions, what kinds were there, and how do we tell this from the archaeological record? A lot of sources typically look at either the poorest of the poor, which gives them a voice through the archaeological research, and this is especially important in documenting marginalized communities or people whose histories have been erased. Other sources look at some of the Richie Riches of the past, and because of their opulent lives, they collect so much stuff, and that stuff gets buried, and then we get to look at it. Because the Richie Riches were the first to want to flaunt their status to their community by following the latest trends, they were always striving to be bigger and better than the person next door and accumulated more and more stuff. Carol Nicolai's Class and Gender in 19th Century Rural Michigan, the Merriman Sharp Hillside Farm, is one such example. The house was first owned by Mary, but managed by her husband, Dwight Merriman. The hillside farm averaged twice the amount of land and produce compared to the rest of the Jackson County area at the time. The ownership of the house is unique as it was uncommon for women to be the sole owner of the entire farm, let alone such a successful farm. Although I have found other sources that despite it being uncommon, it does not mean it is completely unheard of. As the years progress, the owners of the house, first the Merrimans and then their daughter Ella Sharp, changed the facade of the house to reflect their growing wealth to their neighbors. As Nicolai said, quote, "This decision was affected by two considerations. First, the original house was small, and second, it did not accurately reflect their social and financial status." End quote. Their efforts were successful, and the house became the talk of the town. The Merrimans also built a fence to, quote, "express their class affiliation," end quote. It was an expensive project, requiring a stonemason to be brought in from New York. Although they lived outside of town amongst farmers, the Merrimans used their wealth to reflect their status by emulating the trends that were popular within town. Another reflection of their wealth was their gardens. Only the wealthy would have vast amounts of leisure time to dedicate to ostentatious gardens. A set of dishes with gold lettering of the family name was also another way for them to certify their wealth, although in this case it was more for those who would engage in the private spaces, such as during a dinner party. Nicolai's deductions about Ella Sharp's role within her family and her city is based on the archaeological materials of her home. As she puts it, quote, "Many upper middle class and upper class women turned their attentions to the public world once they had reformed the private world of their own homes," end quote. Nicolai notes that the presence of two gentlemen's chairs in the parlor, instead of a larger gentleman's chair and a smaller lady's chair, indicates that Ella and her husband John did not conform to the gender roles of the time and saw each other as equals. As I said much earlier in this video, context can reveal so much more about the objects we find than analyzing just the object itself. Nicolai remarks that, quote, "The placement of these formal and informal rooms and how they articulate with each other may serve as metaphors for the social relationships they embody," end quote. In other words, analyzing the relationships between the spaces that Mary and Ella created within their home reveals to us what kinds of social relationships and status they were trying to convey to the public. Alright, but what about the poor? Well, there is still lots that archaeology can tell us about them. For example, an article by Lynch tells the story of those buried in pauper graves in poor law union workhouses. Even before the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, poverty and employment was taking a drastic effect on the population of Ireland. In 1838, poor law unions created workhouses for those who were in abject poverty. The people in the workhouses were split up by gender, and adults were separated from the children, except in children under the age of 2 who could remain with their mothers. Their meals included potatoes, which is a staple crop across the world. However, once the potato shortages started to take effect, many people in the workhouses began to die from disease and famine. An archaeological survey of the skeletal remains of those at the workhouses who died and were buried there underwent in the early 2000s. Data was used from 3 workhouses, and on the most part the bones were not in great condition due to water erosion. Most of the adult skeletons were middle adults, which means that they are aged from 25 to 44 years, and the sex divisions were nearly equal. That said, Lynch reports that, quote, "The demographic profile of the 3 workhouse populations revealed that there were high proportions of juveniles in the sample, individuals being 17 years of age or less at the time of death." End quote. Those entering the workhouses were those in absolute destitute situations and often included orphans. And despite their bleak lives in the workhouses, those buried in them did have some dignities given to them in death. Coffins were used in all 3 of the workhouses' burials, and respect for the individual was demonstrated by the use of the coffins and for the individual plots marking a burial. This means that there was no overlapping graves. Each individual plot for the individual person was respected. There was no overlap or crossing over anywhere. Personal items such as religious items, for example rosary beads, were found in some of the graves. This is not to say that the individuals that lived in these poor law union workhouses were treated with the utmost respect even within death, as there were laws that, quote, "allowed the use of the unclaimed pauper corpses for dissection in anatomy schools," end quote. However, the evidence of coffins and personal items within the graves, and that the graves did not overlap or that there were no mass graves, suggests that even the poorest of the poor during the Victorian period were expected to be treated with at least some respect, by at least burying them properly. So this has been my introduction video for today. I hope you will join me next time to check out my mourning jewelry and fashion video. Bye!